tour on famous baseball players and people famous from different worlds. And I was intrigued by why America embraced the heroes that we do, why somebody became a hero. And I decided I wanted to look at that by looking at the guy who had been the longest lived American hero of the last century. And the longest lived hero, as you all know, was not Jack Kennedy, and it was not Mickey Mantle or Babe Ruth. It was Superman, who was 74 years old and shows no sign of aging, and is, I think, going to go on forever. So it was partly for a serious purpose of looking at heroes that I wrote this book. But the real reason I wrote this book was not a serious reason. It was that I wanted to be 10 years old again. And there's no way better, as you all know, than to feel like you're 10 years old again and to go back to a character that I've loved since I was 10 years old. And I want to just tell you real quickly a few of the things that I found out about Superman that I didn't know before. How many of you have been Superman fans all your life? Yeah. When did you start? When did you first?
I was 4 or 5 years old, 1957.
And was it the TV show or the comic book? What brought you to Superman?
You know, I'm not sure which came first. I think the TV show, and they're right there, right next to each other.
How about, sort of back to when did you first grow to love Superman?
We're lucky to come back.
Yeah. Through the comic books or TV or what? TV. Okay, so what I did was, I started out with comic books and then I got addicted to Noel Neill and Jimmy Olsen and Superman on TV. But when I started writing this book, I wanted to go back to the story of where Superman was born. Who knows who created Superman? Who created Superman?
Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster in Cleveland, Ohio.
They did. In what year do you think?
Probably about 1934.
That's very good. It was around then. So what we've done is, we've speculated a lot about what they were thinking about, what Jerry and Joe were thinking about. There have been lots of books and lots of articles written about what they were thinking about. And in the course of writing this book, somebody put on my desk something that gave a little bit different kind of insight. It was about a 150-page memoir that Jerry Siegel wrote and that was never published. And it's come out as part of a lawsuit. You know that they have a lawsuit going on to try to reclaim the heirs of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster are trying to reclaim the rights to Superman. And as part of that, a large memoir that Jerry wrote, and he never got, nobody's ever seen the light of day of, came out. And it told a little bit about what Jerry was thinking about when he created the character. What do you know about the story of Jerry? You know why he did it?
I've heard some theories.
Yeah, what are the theories? Does this work?
His father was gunned down. I heard that Jerry's father was murdered, that he was shot, which is why Jerry would dream of a bulletproof savior. Some people attribute Jerry was Jewish, and there are several legends in Jewish lore of an invulnerable savior that overlooks them. There's a couple to start with.
Those are great to start with. In fact, you're going to come up and finish the talk up here. Anybody else know anything about Jerry Siegel or Joe Shuster? What happened with them? So, one of the theories is that Jerry's dad was gunned down during a robbery. And the fact is that's not true. What happened was, there was a robbery. Jerry's dad, this is Cleveland, Ohio, in the middle of the Depression. And Jerry's dad owns a used clothing store. And one afternoon, a couple guys come into the used clothing store, and they end up looking around and walking out with a suit of clothes that they haven't paid for. And Jerry's dad, who has a very weak heart, he was never gunned down, there was no violence that the police ever reported or anybody else did. But Jerry's dad has a heart attack during his robbery at his clothing store. And by the time they get him to the hospital, he is dead. And Jerry is the sixth of 6 kids, the youngest of 6 kids of this guy who owns this huge clothing store. And at a very tender age, as a teenager, he loses his dad. And so he is devastated. His dad and his hero is gone. And he stays up at night and he dreams. Jerry Siegel was a kid, as he says in his memoir, who always, when he was at school, was the shrimpiest kid in the class and the one who got picked on the most. And the kids used to tease him. They used to call him, instead of Seagull, S-E-I-G-E-L, they used to call him S-E-A-G-U-L-L. And they used to say, you're like a bird, you're the seagull. And Jerry dreamed about actually being a bird, having the power to fly away when the kids were teasing him. And he used to go up on his garage roof, and he would jump off holding an umbrella from his garage roof and pretend that he could fly. And he was a little kid, like lots of those kids, like me and maybe like some of us, who when we were a kid, wished that people could see inside of us. And see, we weren't this mild-mannered kid who wore glasses and who was a little too round and a little too short, like Jerry Siegel. They wanted people to see the real Superman in him. And so as he tells the story in his memoir, he played out this story of a guy he called Superman. And the first Superman that he dreamed up was S-U-P-E-R-M-A-N. And it was a guy who was an evil character, a guy who was a bad man who wanted to take over the world. And as he kept writing new versions of the story, he dropped the hyphen and he dropped the bad guy. And it ended up that Superman became a heroic character who, in the very first drawing that we have of Superman, he was shown fending off robbers like the guys who came and robbed his dad's store. And at the very moment that Jerry Siegel was dreaming up, this little boy who had lost his dad was dreaming up a hero that might have been able to save his dad, America, more than it ever has maybe in our history, needed a hero. We were in the middle of the Great Depression, which is not tough to imagine because we're in the middle of the Great Recession right now that never seems to go away. Things were bad for people. We were about to go to war in Europe. A big war was raging already. And America needed a hero. And there's never a moment, I think maybe in the history of the world, where there was a better coincidence of a book that was coming out talking about a hero and a country that needed a hero to believe in as it was trying to take on a depression and a war. And so it was perfect timing. And he came out with his first Superman comic book, which after having lots of people turn it down, finally he found a publisher who believed in it. In what year? Do you know what year the first comic book was?
1938.
In 1938. The date on the cover was June 1938, but it was more like April or May, and it was the perfect moment. And Chris, how did the first comic book do? Did I say Chris and Neil? These are two guys, by the way, who know more about Superman than anybody in the world. Neil founded the Superman Super Site, and Chris writes for it. And what is he? Chris and Neil, how did the first comic book do you think?
It did very well. I think the first copy of it sold, what, 10 million, I believe?
Not that many, but it did very well.
1 million?
It sold about 100,000 for the first comic book, and every issue after that started taking off to the point where they weren't quite sure what was going on. Back then, the comic books had lots of stories in it, and Superman was only on the cover. It was Action comic books. And Superman was only on the cover about every third or fourth issue. And they weren't sure, was it Superman or was it some magic story deep in the comic book? They weren't sure quite what did it. But they started watching. By the time they got to about issue 13, it was selling nearly 500,000. And that was, comparing it to other comic books which never broke 100,000, 500,000 was extraordinary. And they realized they had a gold mine. And that's when it took off. What I want to do is tell you just a couple other quick things about Superman that you may not know, and then I'd love to turn it open to questions. Any idea what Superman's religion was? Anybody ever think about whether Superman had a particular faith? What do you think? Let's try. Chris, what do you think?
According to the comic book affiliation guide, Superman's true religion is Methodist. Now, I don't know if it was that at the very beginning, but I'm going to go with Methodist.
Great. We have Methodist, and this is a guy who every year wins the Superman Jeopardy contest, so that's probably a pretty good guess. Anybody else know anything about Superman's fate? Larry, back here, do you know anything about that? Okay, so what I want to do is tell you, you can say you heard it here first, is that I make the argument that Superman was Jewish. And anybody know, what is Superman's name from the planet Krypton? Kal-El. Anybody here speak Hebrew? You know what Kal-El means? Kal-El means in Hebrew, El is God. Like in Samuel or in Israel or in all the prophets had El at the end of their name. And Kal in Hebrew means the vessel of God. And I think that what Jerry Siegel was doing, he grew up Jewish, and I think what he was doing was giving us, playing with us a little bit. And the vessel of God comes down. What does the story of Superman in the Bible remind you of? A story from the Bible. Somebody sending off their only child, putting them out into the river of space, and somebody finding them and adopting them as their own. What is that the story of? Moses, the story of Exodus. Well, I would suggest to you that the destruction of Krypton is the story of Genesis, and the story of Superman being floated out in space and being picked up and adopted in the middle of Kansas is the story of Exodus. There's also one more clue. There are a lot of clues on Superman being Jewish. But anytime a name ends in the word man, whether it's Silverman or Cooperman or whatever it is, that person is either Jewish or a superhero. But the fact that I tell you that he's Jewish doesn't mean that lots of other religions don't claim him. If Superman is the story of Moses, what's another way to see this story of somebody sending off their only son sending him to Earth to rescue mankind, to show mankind that it can be better than it was. What's that?
Jesus.
The story of Jesus. So Christians, there have been entire books written on how Superman is the story of Jesus. And there are religious school classes taught by Methodists and taught by Catholics and taught by ministers all across America that talk about Superman being Christian. But those aren't the only people who have adopted him. Buddhists think that Superman is the perfect Zen-like character. Who could be more Zen than Superman? Atheists think that Superman is the perfect secular hero, the secular messiah. Everybody loves Superman enough that everybody can invent a credible story on why Superman is just theirs. So Superman has become a story that's part of our folklore in religion, in popular culture, in everything from TV and radio to comic books and graphic novels. What I would love to do though now is stop talking and take questions. Anybody, I spent 2 years wandering around the country and interviewing 200 people, the people who started Superman, the people who wrote his TV and radio stories, all kinds of things. And I'd love to answer any questions that you have about Superman. Any questions here? Where's Sarah?
You mentioned the Zen Wars. Is there any way to get a hold of, for a typical person like me to ever get a hold of that?
That's a good question. Lots of great stuff was released. If you really care about Superman and want to dig into his history, the best trove of information that has ever been out there is all the stuff that came out as part of the Superman lawsuit. And the way to get the memoir, and the way to get any of this information is the lawsuit was filed in California. There's a court, a federal district court in Riverside, California, that has all these documents. And if you can't find it online, look for it, get in touch with the court. If you can't find it, email me, and I'll help point you the way to get the memoir. But the memoir has never been out there and really published, and I think that tells the story of Jerry Siegel in a unique way. Why don't you tell us who you are?
Oh, hi, yeah. My name is Mark. This is my wife, Anna. He's from all the way from Ocean City, Maryland. Just for this. Why wasn't Superman Returns successful enough to merit a sequel? It breaks my heart. I think it's a love letter to Superman from the Time movie. Why don't you think it merited a sequel? Why wasn't it successful?
I thought that, without any offense to Chris Reeve, we're having a a book party for this book on Monday when I get back to Boston. And Christopher Reeve's 2 brothers, his father, his whole family is going to be there. And I think Christopher Reeve was brilliant, but I also think Brandon Routh did a really great job. And I thought that was going to start a whole new series of movies, and so did Warner Brothers. And there's only one reason. What it did at the box office, it never brought in the brilliant Richard Donner movie, broke box office records back then, and it surpassed all the expectations of Warner Brothers and the Salkins when they produced that movie. And it's simply a matter of money. Brandon Routh and Bryan Singer would have had a whole new series of Superman if they had done better at the box office. And now they're going to try it again with, what's the guy's name? The Tudors. Cabot, yes. And we'll see whether they can get another franchise. What worries me more than any of this is whether Superman continues to have a history, continues to have a future, if Warner Brothers and the heirs to Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's family can't figure out how to divide it up. And right now, as those of you who follow the lawsuit know, different elements of the character either belong to Time Warner and Warner Brothers or to the heirs, and I can't remember. The Cape, I think, is the heirs, and the Flying is Warner Brothers, and they divide it up. You can't take a character. It's like the famous biblical story, who are they trying to divide up? Exactly. And that's the only way to save the baby is to save the baby and not try to divide it up. And I hope we get a settlement sometime soon where that movie that comes out next summer will be the last time we have a movie in Superman. Other questions here? Yes, good question. So we talk a lot, and everybody always talks a lot about Jerry Siegel. And Jerry Siegel wrote this long memoir telling us more than many of us might even want to know about all that he did. And Joe Shuster was always the player's partner. And he was the one who intrigued me more than Jerry. Jerry had a very facile pen and a loud mouth, and he was going out and telling his story. Joe was the guy. I talked to lots of Joe's family members, including his sister, and he was the guy who was always the quiet guy and sort of got dragged along with what Jerry wanted to do. And the good news was that Jerry wanted to do Superman, and he got dragged along with that. The bad news was that when Jerry wanted to sue DC Comics, and then sue them again, and then sue them again, Joe always sort of got dragged along with that. And I found evidence, as part of the book research, that Joe Shuster was actually trying to do a deal with, I think it was with Harry Donenfeld, who was one of the original owners of DC Comics, that Joe Shuster wanted to branch out and do some other interesting things. It was tragic, because as you all probably know, the worst things that can happen to an artist is that they lose their eyesight or they lose their dexterity in their hand. And Joe was losing both. He was going blind, and at the end of his life, he had a very difficult time seeing it all. And over the years, his hand had some kind of palsy, and he had a really difficult time drawing. So as an artist, he was losing the basis of his trade, and as a human being, he was getting sucked up in all the things that Jerry wanted to do and some of Jerry's anger. And I wish we had had a chance to see what Joe could really have done if he were freer to operate on his own. He's a really interesting story, and that was a good question. Any other questions here? Neil.
I had an opportunity to get a review copy of your book, and one of the things I wanted to ask you about was the entire process of making the original Superman the movie with the Salkins. There's some pretty eye-opening things in there that you had written about the entire process of the film first being thought of to the final product. I was wondering if you could just elaborate on what some of those eye-opening things were as it came from.
Anybody who knows Neil knows that he's a diplomatic guy. Eye-opening is a modest way of saying there were some shocking things in terms of what happened with the film and some really scurrilous things. And we're talking about the original Christopher Reeve movie. And some of the crazy things that were going on is the guy who was directing the film, who was Richard Donner, hated the guy who was producing the film, who was the Salkins, father and son, Salkin, Alex Salkin and his son Ilya. They hated even more a guy named Pierre Pierre Spengler, who was sort of their money guy who was watching things. So you have a creative guy over here, and the money people over here, and they think, the money people think that Donner is spending too much money. Donner thinks that the Salkins and Spengler are thieves, and both were a little bit right. Donner was spending a lot of money because he wanted to make a great film, and he did. The Salkins were sort of these crazy, not quite thieves, because they managed to pull it off, but they were as close to a Ponzi scheme, without being a Ponzi scheme. They would raise money. I think if we went and looked at the actual percentages of the film, we'd find out that the Salkins might have sold about 200% of that film, because everybody had a little share somewhere. But they were real characters. One of the only people on the planet Earth who didn't know who Superman was when this whole film process started was Alex Salkin, who was the money guy behind the film. His son was saying to him, we ought to do a film on Superman. And his response was, I can't remember what that Cafe in Paris was, Super Who? And he was a guy who had grown up in Germany and in Mexico and in Russia and all around the world. And he really had no idea who the superhero was. But he knew movies, he knew how to raise money, and it all worked brilliantly. And so for all the disarray behind the scenes, all that really matters to us, I think, should be the product. And if anybody can ever show me a better version of Superman than that uncut original Donner film, then I'd like to see it.
Along with the Salkins, now they also did a TV show called Superboy.
Say going low or
Going along. Going along with the Salkins. They did a great job with Superman 1 and 2. Not going to touch 3 and 4. They also did another good show, which is Superboy. Do you believe that the lawsuits that are coming out will we able to see seasons 2, 3, and 4 on DVD?
I really worry about Superboy more than anything in terms of the future of these lawsuits, because it looks like Superboy will probably go to the Siegel and Schuster's heirs, because that was something that they clearly invented. And I worry about that. And Mark Christopher's not here. No, it's not here now. Okay. Anyway, I think that there are a lot of really good TV shows that came out of Superman and Superboy. On my list was a bit lower down, but I think the Salkins, as you say, did a brilliant job with 1 and 2. 3 and 4 were when they started to make money. Even though the films were garbage, particularly 4, they started to draw in more money because they paid off all the expenses. And so that's why we got 3 and 4. They didn't care much about the artwork then. They wanted these things to be available to go on TV, and they made a fair bit of money. And my favorite of all they say about Superman, that your first Superman, the first time you ever saw him on the screen, big screen or little screen, is the one you fell in love with and liked the best for the rest of your life. And my favorite was the one that I grew up with as a kid, which was the original TV Adventures of Superman, which is why I think it's brilliant that they have a statue down here of Noel Neill. I think it's brilliant that Larry in the back of the room here wrote this terrific book, which if you haven't seen, you want to, on Noel Neill. And I think it's great that Jack Larson and Noel Neill are still alive and doing pretty well, and that George Reed's memory goes on. Any other questions here? Any questions? If I can for you,
One final question, and that is you were talking about the concerns over the lawsuit, different people owning different pieces of the legend and all this stuff. I remember the years after Star Trek, the original TV show had been off the air a long time, but before the first movie came, you know, there's a whole bunch of them now, but it was years before the first movie came, and the word we got on the street was Hollywood was afraid to make it, and the fans just rallied and held things just like this for years, and finally it happened, and now there's a whole bunch. Do you feel, notwithstanding all the legal things and all these other things going on, Superman being one of the most well-known popular characters on Earth, that fans well alone can keep him intact regardless of the way the lawsuit goes?
Yes, I'm an optimist, and I believe the fans will insist that Superman be around. And I also believe that they have settled the lawsuit. The saddest thing to me about this lawsuit is, so the heirs of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster filed a lawsuit, and Jerry has already died. The 6 months ago, when did Jerry's widow die? When did Joanne Siegel die? Sometime in the last year, she died. Joe Shuster's only really close surviving relative is his sister, and she's had a stroke and can barely talk, and she's not going to be around for a long time. So by the time they settle this lawsuit, it's going to be much more distant heirs, and the lawyer who was filing the lawsuit who are going to get all the money. And it's sad to me that if it was going to be a lawsuit, and they're going to try to have restitution for having bought Superman from Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster for how much money? $130. They're having bought it for $130. The idea that they'll probably get tens and maybe hundreds of millions is a nice thing, but it would really be nice if somebody was around who was a part of that originally. But I think the fans are going to ensure that this happens. We see the same day that my book is officially out, which is next Tuesday, June 12th. What else is happening in Superman's life on June 12th? A movie is coming out. The animated film Superman versus the Elite. And that is coming out. DC and Warner Brothers are committed enough to do that. They're making the new Superman movie. They understand. If they don't understand the justice of giving something, and I think they've made some quite reasonable offers to the heirs, they understand that they've got to get on with Superman and continue making money because people love Superman. And I think he's going to go on long beyond the time that anybody in this audience is alive to watch him. There'll still be a Superman. Great. Just two more and then we'll wrap it up here.
You talked about the original TV show that was your favorite when you were a kid. And that Jerry Siegel, he had a story from his youth is what inspired Superman about his father. What is the best way nowadays to get the young kid interested in Superman? Do you think that there is anything but the original TV shows and the old serial?
I despaired of that when I started writing my book. I knew I cared about it, and people like me with gray hair or no hair cared about it, and I wondered if it was a new generation. And then I started watching what was going on. In my hometown every year, they have a huge Halloween party in the afternoon, and the only thing that touched Superman in terms of costumes was Spider-Man. And I actually started counting Superman outnumbered Spider-Man. And I wondered where these kids picked up their interest in Superman. And it was partly Smallville, it was partly the appearance, it was partly just something about the story. I believe that the story that Jerry Siegel partly accidentally landed, that was such a brilliant story, the way that's been fine-tuned, I think that people would be idiots if they didn't come out with new TV shows to get kids interested, and the movies will do it, the film out this summer, the film out next summer. If there's this groundswell, people who are trying to make money off it, you don't have to worry about that. They're going to keep coming out with new ways. And I think it's going to go on. And is his interest entirely based on your interest, or where did he pick up on it?
I always watched Smallville. I had him on working like Superman. We got into all the animated Superman TV shows, 15 minutes long that he loved.
So it's Smallville. Smallville just went off the air. When did it go off the air? Yes. So I don't know for a fact, but I can assure you somewhere in Warner Brothers Studios, they're already working on what the next incarnation is. That was so much more successful than they ever dreamed it would be. It lasted, was it 9, how many years? 10 years. Now 10 years for a TV show in these days is extraordinary in terms of the lifespan. And they watch that, and they know the numbers, and they know about kids like him who are coming along and doing it, so they'll do it. They'll be back with it.
One more question for me. Speaking of dramatic departures from the traditional Superman, there's the Lost Superman movie, the 1998 Superman Lives, that was supposed to be Nicolas Cage's Superman and Tim Burton directing, and Superman dies and is reanimated as a robot, and it's a black suit with glowing lights and no cape. Is this, I know that the movie was supposed to exist and then kind of self-imploded, but do you know anything in detail about whether we think
There have been books written on that in terms of looking into all that. I don't pretend to be the expert. I do recall at some point seeing a script of it, and I may even have one somewhere, but I think it imploded for lots of reasons in terms of having wrong producers, and I know that Nicolas Cage has nothing in his life other than he ended up earning a lot of money on it without doing any work on it because it never was made. But I know he would have loved to have done it, and do you know any more about what happened to Superman? Because I thought that was going to happen.
The only thing I know is that it's an old expression, too many cooks spoil the stew, and that's what was going on with that movie. They were trying to get... Well,
I was just going to add to it. I know that after quite a number of years of just constant, never actually being able to get to move forward, Nicolas Cage in an interview said that it had just been too much time and he had basically removed himself from the project. So, and I'm sure, I would hope a lot of people would agree that I'm very thankful that the movie never was made. Because, I mean, can you really imagine Nicolas Cage playing Superman? I mean, you got to see him as Ghost Rider, and if that didn't make you want to claw your eyes out, I can imagine what Superman would do.
By the way, one of the things that does, watching how many cooks and the difficulty of getting it done, makes me have more respect. One of the craziest guys that I've ever met in strangest interviews, which was going to be an hour interview and turned into 5 or 6 hours, was with Elias Salkin, who was a producer of the Chris Reeve Superman movies, and he is a really wacky guy. And he got to the point where his girlfriend, who was with us having dinner, at the end of 2.5, 3 hours, she excused herself because she was tired of hearing him talk, and I wanted to hear him as long as he was going to talk. But it gives me new respect for what they managed to pull off. These two European guys who came in and didn't really understand Superman, and they pulled off 4 movies, and they got, with help from Richard Donner, Chris Reeves, who was as perfect a Superman as I think you could ever find. And it's just the idea of, with all those crazy cooks that they had in their kitchen, that they produced a product as good as that is really something. And I think that's probably a good note to end on here. And if anybody is interested in the book, it's back there, and I'm going to do some signing. And I just appreciate all of you coming out on a Monday like this to hear about the book and Superman.